The time is now 3:02 here in Bangkok, and we will actually now begin the event. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Maggie Lee. I'm representing the Sea Circular Project at the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. And welcome to all of you who are from near and far to this virtual launch of the new publication from UNEP and Food Industry Asia, FIA. It's called Perceptions on Plastic Waste, Insights in Interventions and Incentives to Action from Businesses and Consumers in Southeast Asia. Once again, my name is Maggie Lee, and I'm actually stationed on the Sea Circular Project, which is one of the UNEP initiatives from also with the coordinating bodies on the seas of East Asia, COBSEA, to inspire market-based solutions and encourage enabling policies to prevent marine plastic pollution. So a couple of housekeeping remarks before we start with the main program. If you could please keep your mics on mute unless you are speaking, and also your videos off for the duration of this event. This would also help the meeting to be smoothly running because of the bandwidth issues. And also, please be reminded that this meeting is being recorded. We will provide an opportunity for question and answer at 3:30 sharp Bangkok time. In the meantime, please feel free to write any questions or comments in the chat box that's in this Microsoft Teams. So today we are very proud to launch this new report, the result of more than 9 months of intensive research and collaboration. We hope you are as excited by the findings of the report as we are. In this virtual launch, we will introduce our new publication, highlight some of the major findings, and provide an opportunity for participants like yourselves to ask questions and find out more. We will hear from the ambassador, Stefan Helrom, the Swedish ambassador to Thailand, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, as well as Mr. Matthew Kovac, the executive director of FIA, Food Industry Asia. Also, we do have presenters helping us understand a little bit more about this research. We have Mr. Fraser Thompson, the director of Alpha Beta Singapore, who is our partner in conducting the surveys. He will present to us some key findings and insights from the report itself. And a warm welcome to all the speakers and attendees. I believe we have, if not everyone, most of the people here now. I would like to call on Dr. Isabel Lewis, the Deputy Regional Director of UNEP Asia and the Pacific Regional Office, to help us provide some opening remarks and a warm welcome to you all. May I invite Isabel, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Maggie. Your Excellency, Stefan Helrom, Swedish Ambassador to Thailand, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, Mr. Matthew Kovac, Executive Director of Food Industry Asia, Dr. Fraser Thompson, the Director of Alpha Beta Singapore, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to join all of you here today at the launch of this report, Perceptions on Plastic Waste. I think we are all very, very clear that plastic pollution is choking the waters of Southeast Asia, choking many species and the very ecosystems on which we depend, and affecting life as a whole. Achieving clean seas and beating plastic pollution requires systemic changes throughout the plastic value chain. The Sea Circular Project, supported by the government of Sweden, is a key effort to this end. To drive change, we need to fully understand the issue. We need to recognize how perceptions on plastic waste among consumers and businesses in Southeast Asia contribute to creating the problem we are facing and how they can help shape the solutions our society as well as marine ecosystems need. To this end, UNEP has partnered with Food Industry Asia to develop a regional survey of consumers in food and beverage businesses across Southeast Asia to understand more about their perceptions on plastics. Consumers and businesses were polled in 5 countries that are among the largest sources of marine litter globally: Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Fundamental questions were asked about plastic use, whether they have changed their plastic use behaviors and why. And they also asked them whether they plan to change their behaviors. Crucially, they were also asked whether governments, businesses, and consumers could or should do more to end plastic waste. The resulting report contains valuable findings, providing insights into how we can shape interventions to drive positive actions to end plastic waste in Southeast Asia and really deliver on the priorities countries have jointly identified through the UN Environment Assembly, as well as through the coordinating body on the seas of East Asia. From the report, we learn about the disconnect in consumers' expectations and actions, which leads us to look at ways we can motivate and facilitate behavior change. There is also significant interest from businesses to do more to end plastic waste, which motivates efforts to engage with the business community to generate and share solutions. It is heartening to note that these crucial stakeholder groups are encouraging governments to take further action. Where efforts of government, the public, and companies align, fundamental and lasting change can be achieved. This report will also be useful for our own work, and we are grateful for the support and partnerships that enabled us to prepare it. We hope it will be equally useful for all of you, and together we can achieve the goal of less plastic wasted and less plastic pollution in nature. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Matt Kovac, the Executive Director of FIA, for the collaboration and joining this launch today, as well as Fraser Thompson, Director of Alpha Beta Singapore, who will share more detailed findings of the survey. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize and thank Ambassador Hellstrom, who will be leaving for a new posting shortly. Stefan, it has been such a pleasure to work with you over the past years. You basically have lifted us to step up and address this important issue. You have lent your voice to many pressing issues, let alone plastic pollution, marine litter, human rights, gender mainstreaming, and to ensure that no one is left behind. And you have been such a force behind our joint Sea Circular project, stepping up and making sure that it touches on the key players and actors that are essential to succeed in this amazing challenge we have around us. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And I hope that, although the circumstances don't allow us to meet as we would have liked to, we hope we will have the pleasure of your company soon at some point to see you. And on behalf of UNEP, I wish you all the best in your move and looking forward to continuing our close collaboration with your successor and the Swedish government. Once again, thank you, and I wish you a successful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for your remarks. And I would like to now introduce Mr. Matthew Kovac, the Executive Director of Food Industry Asia, or FIA, to provide opening remarks on behalf of FIA.
Hello, so good afternoon. So it's a pleasure to be here on this webinar, and I'm very happy to be representing Food Industry Asia. And I'd like to say thank you very much to UNEP for partnering with FIA on this survey, and to Alpha Beta for conducting it on behalf of us. It's a pretty significant piece of work. And considering that we've covered around 400 food and beverage businesses and surveyed about 2,000 consumers across 5 different countries to understand their attitudes and actions on tackling plastic waste. It does provide some very interesting insights, and if we didn't provide interesting insights, we would be hosting this webinar. But one of them that I'd like to pull out, and I don't want to steal Fraser's thunder from the details he'll go through, is that 50% of consumers want household waste segregation to be mandated. And I thought that was quite interesting, just from my perspective, is perhaps that means that consumers just need a serious amount of help with understanding how they separate waste and how they can recycle it, and how do we make it easier for them, which won't be easy given the current climate of COVID, where perhaps some of the attention around sustainable packaging and plastics maybe not right at the top of the agenda because people are concerned about public health and jobs. But nevertheless, what I will say on that matter is that definitely that governments, multilateral organizations like UNEP, but also the industry, are still very much focused on how we address this significant problem.
Hello? I'm afraid we may have a connection problem. Matt, are you still there with us? Matt, I'm afraid you might be having a bad connection. So if I may actually skip to the next bit before we actually get Matt back. Unfortunately, we'll have to actually get Matt to present to us his opening speech after this. So I'd like to actually invite now Mr. Fraser Thompson, the director of Alpha Beta Singapore, who is our partner in conducting the surveys, to present the key insights and interventions at this point. Thank you, Fraser. You're on mute.
Thanks very much for the chance to showcase the findings today. My name is Fraser Thompson, Director of Alpha Beta, and we had the pleasure of providing the analytical support for this research. And briefly, before I go through the findings, I guess a word about why we think this is so important. The 5 focus countries that we look at in this research, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam, are currently among the top 10 sources of plastic marine debris globally. We also know that these 5 economies are really at the sort of, if you like, the start of a rapid growth cycle and a potential doubling of the consuming class. And so what is already an issue today could potentially get far, far worse with a business as usual trajectory. But unfortunately, despite the significance of the problem, there's surprisingly little we know about consumer and business attitudes to plastic waste. And so this was really the starting point for that. And we believe it's important for 2 reasons. One, by properly understanding the perceptions of consumers and businesses, we can better craft policy interventions. And secondly, it also gives us a chance to measure progress as we go forward to see what the shift has been. And I think it's great to see that Sea Circular and FIA have talked about repeating this survey to measure progress going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn my video off just to save the internet bandwidth, and then I'm going to talk you through some of the results over the next 10 minutes. So if we move to the next page, thanks very much. Just a brief overview of how the research was done. We had a consumer survey and a business survey. So on the consumer survey, this was translated into local languages and focused on the 5 countries, so Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. We did quotas to make sure that the sample of people that we spoke to reflected the demographics of the country. So in terms of gender, age, income, etc. And to ensure some basic statistical significance, we had a minimum sample size of 400 respondents in each country. We did on this try to get a sense of the differences between urban areas and less urban areas. So we looked at sort of tier 1 versus other cities to try to also get a breakdown of if we saw any significant differences there. Then on the business survey, we also covered the same 5 countries. And we worked with F&B associations in each of the 5 countries to survey a minimum of 50 businesses in each country. And our survey partners in each of the countries are listed there on the right-hand side. And a big thank you to them for all the terrific efforts that they did in helping us put together this research. So moving on to the insights, and so next page. First of all, starting with the consumer insights, I think what is really interesting is that we see this disconnect between consumers having concern for plastic waste issues and actually translating into changes in their purchasing decisions. So you see here across the 5 countries that we see 91% of respondents said that they are extremely concerned by the extent of plastic waste issues. And that gives cause for good optimism that we'll see a shift here. But then we start to see a drop-off. First of all, only 66% said they regularly look at products to understand if the material's been recycled before they buy them. And then less than half say that if a product is made of non-recycled material, they're less likely to buy it. So there's a gap between, if you like, intention and action that's going to be crucial to bridge as we go forward. Moving on to the next slide. We also dug a little bit deeper into this, and whilst there were a lot of similarities across the 5 countries, there were some important differences. And I'll just highlight one of those differences in this slide. So we asked each of the respondents what was the frequency of which their household waste was collected. Daily, weekly or less, monthly or never. And what's interesting is you see here in Indonesia, there was 25%, roughly a quarter of respondents say they never have household waste collection. That compares with, at the lowest there, just 1% in Vietnam. So whilst there are a lot of similarities we saw across countries, there are these important differences, which obviously means that when crafting interventions, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Moving on to the next slide, a key question we looked at was, how do we engage with consumers? So particularly given that we have this sort of gap, if you like, between willingness and actual action, what's the right way to have a better engagement? And consumers said that in the survey said that 88% said social media is the best route for engaging consumers. And what's interesting in particular is that a lot of consumers said that they're looking particularly for more information about how to properly understand recycling and to do that in a more rigorous manner. So I think there's a number of topics there potentially that could be part of that kind of social media outreach to consumers. Now, moving on to the next slide. This is moving from the consumer survey to the business survey. And what's interesting is that businesses realize that this issue is important, but they also realize that their efforts to date are not enough. Now, obviously, there's a huge spectrum of different activities across the private sector, and this doesn't apply to every firm, and there's many firms that are taking really active leaps, but across the board, we do see this gap. So if you look at this question here, we asked, first of all, is your company concerned about plastic waste issues? And so 82%. It's actually not too dissimilar from the 91% of consumers who said that they were very concerned about this. But then if we start going down the list, we see there's a bit of a drop off. So about 73% say they actively monitor their plastic usage. We also see that only about 55% have dedicated individuals or teams looking at plastic usage and reduction efforts, and less than half actually think that their current efforts to tackle plastic waste are sufficient. So I guess that perhaps is potentially heartening that businesses realise that they are concerned and they realise that they have to go further in addressing plastic waste. And in the survey, we actually asked really specific questions about what aspects of plastic waste they're tackling, everything from product redesign through to increased recycling efforts, both today and in the future. So there's a lot of good material there for those of you interested in understanding that in more detail. Now, moving to the next slide, we tried to get a bit deeper into understanding some of the operational characteristics that businesses were doing in relation to plastic waste. And one of the key starting points is, does the company have a target for addressing plastic waste? And quite heartening here, if you see that 80% of the companies say that they have a target. Now that varies a bit across countries. So in Thailand, you actually see the most who said they have a target. In Malaysia, we actually saw the least with 55%. So it is encouraging that they have the targets, but then we start to see some gaps with those targets. First of all, is that over 2/3 of those targets are only communicated internally. And in fact, that gets as high as almost 87% in certain countries. So companies may have them, but they're not communicating them. And so we lose a bit of the power, if you like, of and traction that goes with that, with making them a publicly available target. And then moving on to the next slide, we also tried to look at how the targets were designed. And we see that, thanks, just moving to the next slide, would be great. We see that actually that most of the targets, quite a lot of the targets are quantitative, which is encouraging because that obviously that gets a degree of precision, but still over a quarter of the targets are not quantitative. So that kind of gives cause for concern that these targets may not be as clear cut and as useful as guidance as we would like. Secondly, we see that over 40% of the targets don't have a timeline. So if we have targets that are not quantitative, that don't have a timeline, their usefulness is far less in terms of guiding action. So we do think there is a real role here for how do we get better target setting amongst businesses, and then particularly important given that the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and other organisations who are doing lots of great work around pledging of companies. How do we make sure that those pledges are really as robust as possible? Now, moving on to the next slide, we ask companies, are they part of any group tackling plastic waste issues? And we ask them, is that a local group, a regional or international group, or are they in multiple different groups? And what's interesting is there's quite a big variation here across the countries. And in fact, Thailand performs best here, that only 24% of firms say that they're not part of any group. And that's kind of encouraging and perhaps reflective of the strong efforts that Thailand has done with multiple public-private partnerships and efforts to really drive more collaboration across businesses. But we see overall, over half of businesses in these countries are not part of any group tackling plastic waste issues. And we think that that's a really missed opportunity, because part of the nature of these issues is it's very hard for one company to move on their own. Given the economics of particularly recycling and product redesign and so forth, there is a huge power of collaboration here where businesses that come together can lower the costs and improve the efficiency with how we develop these respective actions. So we do think there's a real call to arms here about how do we get more businesses engaged in some of these collaborative groups to tackle plastic waste. Now, moving to the next slide, we asked both consumers and businesses what are the most important government policies to support their efforts. And we've just shown the top 10 here from both the consumers and the business side, but there was a whole range of different policy actions that you'll see in the report. And we grouped those policy actions into 5 broad categories. And you see that on the top right-hand side there. So we have actions that are around informing. And informing is basically actions that improve information on waste flows, as well as raise business and consumer awareness. The second group is around financing. So these are actions seeking to support sustainable financing of the system. The third group is around incentivizing. So actions that try to change consumer and business behavior. So this could be things like littering fines or consumer charges. The fourth group is around mandating. So these are requiring certain action changes in behavior. So mandating that products must be recyclable or biodegradable, for example. And the final group is around enabling. So these are actions that support the waste ecosystem in general. Could be training, financing, infrastructure, or technology support. So those were the different groups. And what's interesting, across consumers and businesses, there's quite a lot of similarity in some of the key actions that they're asking for. So the number one action from consumers across the 5 countries was mandating consumer waste segregation. And that's interesting. So quite a strong action there. So going beyond just sort of simple information campaigns to actually making this like sort of a compulsory in one way or other for consumers to properly segregate the waste. Businesses also highlighted that as a key area. In addition, there's other actions related to that. So businesses highlighted the importance of providing information to consumers, developing consistent labeling of products and recognition of those different labels across markets, as well as things like sharing approaches amongst businesses. On the consumer side, we saw different aspects around collection systems, around, again, providing more information to consumers, and various other aspects. So there is if you like, a degree of similarity in where both consumers and businesses think that government policy could be most supportive of the direction of travel going forward. Now, moving on to the next slide and the final slide, I guess the synthesis of this is, well, what does all this mean in terms of interventions going forward? And we separate it here into 3 groups. And by no means is this meant to be exhaustive of all the things that need to happen, but we think this research calls out a few really important points that should shape our efforts going forward. First of all, in terms of consumers, there is this gap between consumer concerns of plastic waste and purchasing actions. And so how do we bridge that gap is going to be a crucial part of our effectiveness going forward in tackling plastic waste. And consumers have told us that social media in particular will be an important way of helping engage consumers on that discussion. The second group, when it comes to food and beverage businesses, there is a clear call to arms around adopting public quantified targets backed by really clear timelines to guide actions. Now, we know that targets by themselves are not going to be the single solution to this, but they are an important starting point. And then secondly, there is a clear need for greater collaboration through local, regional or international initiatives between businesses. And then finally, when it comes to governments, a few of the key things that have been highlighted by participants in the survey include mandated waste segregation, enhancing collection systems, promoting consistent labelling on product recycling, and imposing littering fines and charges. And we think that these are obviously, again, not the exhaustive set of solutions that are going to be needed, but hopefully point us towards where there are some real opportunities for change. And across ASEAN member states, but across Asia, in many countries, there is a significant gap in many of those areas today. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your time, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour for the research. And I really do urge you to engage with the report and take a close read, because there's a lot of really good insights that's come from consumers and businesses from this work.
Thank you so much, Fraser. There's so much more to this report, and I'm sure that all of us are very anxious to see it. So I'd like to invite you to actually go on to Sea Circular's website to download this report for your own reference and also for your studies or learning. And also, please let us know how you find it. At this time, I'd like to actually invite Matt Kovac back, because I believe that he has lots of meaningful messages for us today. Matt, if I may have you.
Hello again. Apologies, technology failed me. So I did see Fraser's presentation there, and I think actually most people have been quite keen to ask questions about the actual data. So thanks for the presentation, Fraser. There is an enormous amount in this, and there's still an enormous amount that should and can be done in many of these markets, if not across others as well. And just to pick up on the last point before I disappeared for a bit. The industry is really willing to try and step up as much as possible to try and counter and act on the issues around packaging and packaging waste. But obviously, the enormity of the problem is it doesn't just rest with a few big brands. It's got to be across the whole supply chain. But the encouraging things are that companies are still making investments. For example, Coca-Cola that recently announced a $100 million investment in a new PET recycling plant in Indonesia. As well as a consortium in Singapore through something called the Circular Materials Lab, which is coming together for put a few $1 million into research on PHA materials and how that might sort of look at marine biodegradable flexible packaging, and that's really encouraging as well. And so the question that perhaps I left off previously was with COVID now. How do we still energize and drive this agenda, given the fact there is going to be quite a big, strong focus on public health and issues around jobs and those sort of things? Look, I'm really pleased that we've been able to work with UNEP and produce this comprehensive piece of data, and I'm just hoping that we can really drive some action on the back end of this. So thanks very much, Maggie.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good to have you back. And if I may take this opportunity to ask all the participants, we do see some familiar faces and names. If we can actually get everyone to turn off their webcams. We do see many of you who have webcams on, and also please mute yourselves. We do see pretty much everybody muted. Thank you so much for helping. We'd like to actually just shut off the webcams so that there's no streaming of other video feeds to take up the bandwidth. And if I may now actually ask His Excellency Stefan Hellström, the Swedish ambassador to Thailand, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar, to join us now for his remarks.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Isabel and all colleagues at UNEP. Thank you, Isabel, for your extremely kind words. it's been so inspiring and energizing to work with you and your colleagues during these years, 5 years I've spent in Bangkok. I bring so many great memories with me from Bangkok when I leave in 3 weeks and move on to my next posting. And of course, one of the major sources of inspiration has been our joint work to address marine plastic litter. So a couple of words of that and related to this report. Now, plastic is obviously a part of our everyday life. The popularity of plastic is due to its positive characteristics: low weight, acid resistance, flexibility, its low production cost, a material which provides new solutions, advances, and well-being. Yet, the tremendous production and consumption of plastic also, as we all know, presents enormous problems, since a large part of the plastic quickly ends up as garbage and pollutes our ecosystems and jeopardizes our right to a clean and healthy environment. Sea Circular is one of the strategic projects supported by the government of Sweden, focused on reducing marine litter through better management of the plastic value chain in Asia. And the important discussion that we must have is, how do we deal with plastics so that it doesn't overburden our capacity to manage waste, so that we capture its value and so that it doesn't become plastic litter in the natural environment to the detriment of our society. The findings in this report are unique, since the report provides us with a good perception of what both the commercial world and consumers in Southeast Asia feel about the production and consumption of plastics. Fascinating to listen to the presentation. It gives us valuable insights and input that can support decision makers to develop the strategies and the reforms that drive and accelerate the behavioral change needed to beat plastic pollution. And importantly, it shows that opinions among consumers and businesses provide ample opportunity for governments to take tangible, effective actions against plastic pollution, such as promoting waste segregation at household level, improving waste collection and recycling capacity, and ensuring better product labeling, all of which will increase recycling rates and encourage what we all want to achieve, a circular economy. Interestingly, Sweden is the country where the plastic bag was invented when I was a kid, by the Swedish engineer Sten Gustaf Thulin in the early 1960s. Somewhat ironically, to reduce excessive consumption of wood for virgin pulp to make paper bags. An insatiable demand for plastic bags in turn contributed to another Swedish organizational innovation, the Extended Producer Responsibility, EPR, which has led to enhanced recycling rates. The purpose of the EPR is to shift the responsibility for the waste away from the municipality to the producer, and to provide incentives for producers to incorporate environmental considerations already in the design of their product with the end of the life cycle in mind. EPR places the responsibility for the proper end-of-life management of the waste products on the individual producers. One outcome of this is that Sweden has attained a level of experience on recycling, circular economy, and effective waste management that results in less than 1% of Swedish household waste going to landfills. Today, it's mandatory for all Swedish households to sort through their waste. This is a key component for the recycling to work. We still need to improve. We need to improve our management of waste to ensure a safe and healthy environment for future generations, for sure. Everything isn't done, but this has worked quite well since the system was introduced in the early 90s. Through the Sea Circular project, I hope that, not least, our lessons of what worked and what didn't work could be shared with Southeast Asia, so that together with the business sector, consumers and policymakers, we can come up with the right solution and the right solutions to reduce plastic pollution and marine litter. I Finally, I want to encourage all of us to use the opportunities that clearly exist in this region to make change happen. And I'm optimistic that we can achieve the significant cultural shift needed and accelerate progress towards our shared development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for your reflections and insights. And as you mentioned, we do recognize that Sweden has a very important and unique role to play in the overall development of global practices for circularity and also for waste management systems. We know that Sweden invented the plastic bag, of course, but also EPR, extended producer responsibility, which is also equally as important in moving on with more environmental and circular ways to deal with our waste and also to deal with things that could not be wasted. So thank you very much, and you will be much missed here in Bangkok. And as well, we would like to also thank the Swedish Embassy and the government of Sweden for their very strong and ongoing support for the Sea Circular project, and of course on the general work of having less plastic wasted. And now it's time for us to move on to our audience. We do have 15 minutes for discussion and question and answer period. So we'd love to actually open the floor for anyone to ask questions that you may have on the report, the findings, or any of the presentations. I would like to actually also highlight and invite our colleague, Ms. Kakuko Nagatani Yoshida, the Regional Coordinator for Chemicals, Waste, and Air Quality, Asia and Pacific Office of UNEP, and also Mr. Edwin Sia, Head of Sustainability of Food Industry Asia, to join me on this. So please directly type any questions for UNEP in the or FIA in the chat box of the Teams meeting that you're on right now. We do have a few people actually messaging us directly. So we do have this question. So I'll read it out right now. Are businesses and consumers changing their plastic use behaviors? I think this question is perhaps asking for an answer from FIA. If I may ask Edwin to help us.
Thanks, Maggie. Hi, everybody. Yes, the quick answer is definitely. And many of the companies within FIA's portfolio of members have already started to look at alternatives to plastics, reducing plastics, and many of them have made commitments to ensure that their packaging are either recyclable, reusable, or compostable by 2025. So definitely, industry is going ahead with all our plans, and we're not dialing back on that.
That's great. We can also confirm that there are companies that have been reaching out to us, to UNEP and Sea Circular, to understand more about how they can do better in terms of recycling and also planning for circularity designs across Southeast Asia. And a point on that is that we know that each country and even each municipality of certain countries have their own waste management systems. And therefore, this leads us to the next question. We have a participant asking us, how can we get governments to improve waste infrastructure like segregation at source? This is also a question that many of us have in mind. If I may invite Kakuko-san to actually help us answer that question, please.
Yes, thank you. I think there are three sort of key to that mandatory segregation, better coverage of waste collection to happen. One is that the government, both national and local level, have to have clear strategy and plan, vision that not managing waste properly is not an option. We have to provide a service for the citizens and the businesses. But once the plan is there, or even better said, the part of the plan is we have to have a plan how to finance it. Now, many local governments are spending way too much of their public budget just collect waste, taking from point A to landfill without any treatment at all. They're spending all the funding they have just burning petroleum to run the truck to collect the garbage and just dump into the open dump. Now, is that the good use of limited public resources? Of course not. So we have to have the stream of income that will service proper sound management of municipality waste. Many decision makers at the local level often reluctant to go very strong on this because they are afraid that there is no willingness to pay from the household or businesses. But luckily, this perception survey contradicts that myth or old understanding. People are willing to commit to better segregation, and even I saw one of the findings was they would like to see fine imposed for those people who are not following the policy. Business want the same thing. So that should be given strong signal to government, both national and local. Their fear of charging for good waste management should be something in the past. And lastly, for those countries who has a good waste management and coverage system, local government and national government work together. Often local government receive steady support from national revenue budget, so that until the local government can come up with financially viable, sustainable waste management system, there are certain subsidy or financial support given from national government to local government. I think this is another key element to make the waste management at the local level sustainable and successful.
Thank you so much, Kako-san, and I do very much agree with you. Another note that I like to also highlight is that in my hometown of Hong Kong, we just actually had a lot of movement on garbage levies, meaning that they want to establish regulations on charging disposal of municipality solid waste. And that bill was just actually recently being passed in the Legislative Council. So we know that this is definitely a trend that's coming to Asia with better segregation and also with better waste infrastructure. So thank you so much for that question. Next, we do have another question. For design for recycling and EPR alone will not be a solution, but all projections are predicting drastic increase of plastic use, which already we know that the population of Southeast Asia is definitely pointing upwards, and that there needs to be a reduction of plastics. This is a comment from Mr. Kai Hoffman, a colleague from GIZ. So it seems like more like a comment than a question, but does any of us, does Edwin or Kako-san would like to answer or add on that?
Yeah, I think it's correct to say that EPR, for example, is definitely not a silver bullet. It is quite an important policy that needs to be applied. But at the same time, I think as Kakuko mentioned, I think governments would also have to look at infrastructure. So it's pointless to increase waste collection when you don't have infrastructure to sort it, to clean it, to recycle it. But at the same time, I think if you look at the survey, especially from the business point of view, what stands out is only about 50% of companies across the 5 countries are part of any platform to tackle the issue. And if you want to apply EPR effectively, you need to get everyone on board. It's not just businesses, it's not just governments, but you also need consumers on board. So I think it's a very, very important point that needs to be emphasized and looked at.
Thank you so much. Next, we do actually have another question. So the mandate of waste separation does not always equate to what waste is being recycled. Is there any movement to ensure all plastics are managed or recycled or disposed of properly? So that is actually a great question that many of us are asking, but of course we do actually have very geographically specific answers for some of those. But if I may actually ask Kakuo-san to actually answer on a macroscopic point of view for Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's a great question because, you know, this notion of recyclable it very much depends on where and on what item we are talking about. Often we, even in a very well-developed waste management countries, consumers are often misled, thinking that they are separating all this waste and these will be material recycles, meaning PET bottle will become another PET bottle. But in reality, at best, it's recycled thermally. That means it's basically burned to create, extract some energy, heat energy, calorific value out of it, but it will never become another PET bottle. I think Sweden is one of very few countries that really pushing for material recycling. And I would like to see in Southeast Asia, now with economic power and support from the citizens and the strong business leaders, to sort of leapfrog some of the recyclability concept, and not only just go for general recycling, but really try to increase material recycling back to the original material. And another thing that I've been challenging the industry in Asia is that can they also increase the recyclable content in their own product? Can they have voluntary commitments, make it public, and try to stick to it? That would really boost recycle industry that need to have good demand for recyclable, because otherwise their business will not be able to succeed. And all that eventually needs to lead to reduction in the petroleum-based packaging and material, reduction in virgin plastics, and contributing to reduction in carbon footprint. That's what we want to aim at when we look at the bigger picture of recycling. Over.
Thank you, Kako-san. And that's a very elaborate response. And of course, we know that by recycling, we do mean mechanical recycling, the traditional way of shredding used or post-consumer plastics into bits so that they can actually be manufactured into plastic pellets, or the smallest form of the polymer plastics, or the polymers of plastics, so that they can be molded into different forms again. This leads us to the next question of other forms of recycling. So we do have a participant asking, is Southeast Asia ready for the more advanced plastic recycling solutions, such as chemical recycling, which also is called pyrolysis, to achieve the circularity goals? We know that pyrolysis and also other forms of recycling have been tested in quite a few places, especially in Indonesia right now. We know that there are attempts and also quite a lot of investment into looking at that. Would Edwin or Kakuo-san have any responses for that from government and from company or corporate standpoints?
I think, Kakuko, I would leave that to you.
Okay, this answer of mine will not be very elaborate one, because I know that there have been now definitely more attempt to go for more advanced or cutting edge type of recycling, like chemical recycling in this region. However, any recycling, not only plastic, but any recycling in this region, the major challenge is collection. For any recycling to work, including chemical recycling, you need a certain amount of waste collected from the point of disposal in a certain condition. If that is not guaranteed, whether it's thermal recycling or mechanical recycling or chemical recycling, will not work. So this is where we come back to the point of the mandatory collection, segregation of the plastic waste and other waste material become very, very important. And I have to say that those cutting edge recycling technology usually cost more than conventional. Again, I will come back to the point of how to make it financially viable is the key.
Yes, and also, of course, asking, thanks for that question. We do actually know that many of us on the call are already experts on plastics and also on the recycling of which. We're very happy to have our colleagues from civil society and also other intergovernmental organizations or help groups here with us. We know that there are already quite a lot of, as I mentioned, efforts into looking into how these innovations would help individual parts of Southeast Asia and looking at specific types of polymers. One thing that I'd also like to point out is that it's not very beneficial for us to think of plastics as one single unit. We have to look at it from a different point of view because plastics was originally the silver bullet. So if we keep thinking about how we find silver bullets to solve this crisis of marine plastics pollution, we will eventually probably wind up with another offsetting type of environmental problem. So we have Another probably more of a rhetorical question from the same participant. Why don't we try to establish an ASEAN regulation on producers' responsibility or government regulation on fine to litter? We do see some head nods, and I'm sure that many of us on the call would agree. Any inputs from our speakers?
Well, I can take this one, simple enough. Yes, I think it's good to have a regional standard or agreement on what an EPR would look like. But I caution again, because even within ASEAN, we are at very different levels of development, maturity, infrastructure. So I think it's good to look at each country individually, where we are at. And I think going back earlier on to Kakuko's point about, can we recycle more into food grade packaging? Yes, definitely that's something that the food industry is keen to do. I think a couple of members have already done so, Danone, for example, in Indonesia. And we're working very closely as an industry with food contact material regulators in Asia to create a bit of a standard on food contact materials so that we can work towards increasing the percentage as we go along. And hopefully then come 2025, it will be 100%. And I think that will be one of the key drivers of ensuring that we recycle more and less of it goes into the environment.
So definitely. So we know that there's quite a lot of disruption already in our regular patterns of consumption of food contact plastics already, as many of us are now working from home, and also during the COVID-19 peak periods when the restaurants are all closed, we were actually ordering either takeout or cooking at home. So this brings us to probably the last question that we have time for. One of our participants has asked, COVID-19 has caused lots of disruption in the waste management system because there's many biohazardous types of waste that is now unfit for recycling. So how would we evaluate the capacity of Southeast Asian countries to effectively handle massive volumes of post-pandemic plastics? So that's a very, very interesting and very narrowed down question for us. So if I may ask Kakuko-san to help us shed some insights on how this may look like. Of course, the COVID-19 crisis has not completely dissipated just yet.
Yes, this is a nice question that gives us a segue and sort of future homework to the UNEP and the FIA and also our sister agency, World Health Organization. I'm happy to say that we already started some preliminary conversation with WHO that expanded use of plastic in name of preventing communal infection of COVID in the food industry, for example, the restaurant, is not really necessary. So this is something that we could work together with FIA, because FIA members are the leaders of national and international market in food and beverage. And if these big companies, big brand names will be able to work with us, that for preventing and ensuring that our society is resilient enough against COVID, doesn't necessarily mean increased use of plastic packaging in the food industry and beverage. Yeah, so that we will not, from the food sector, overburden the waste management sector, because healthcare waste and their plastic use has and will continue to increase because they need more product made of plastic in the healthcare system. But we can do more with the food and tourism industry also, so that the use of plastic packaging, plastic disposal material in those sectors will not increase at the same pace.
Thank you so much for that answer as well. And we're always just nodding, the three of us, because we're very much in agreement with that. And going back to one of our the previous questions is that segregation as source is always a key phrase for us, for those of us who have already worked on plastics and also packaging. We do know that if we can actually have better segregation at source to a higher level of granularity, we can actually establish much higher recycling rates. This is being tested across Southeast Asia at the moment as well. And so many of us who are on this call are very well aware of what's going on, especially those of us who are in the NGOs and intergovernmental organizations. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for questions. We do see some of the questions and reflections in the chat. Rest assured, we definitely have read them. And we hope that we will also continue to have your engagement. But before we leave, I'd like to actually just summarize what happened today is that this event, although we have allotted only a very short time for this, but this is actually an ongoing project in partnership with Food Industry Asia. We will revisit the questions and also the topics that we have looked at today, and also in the report that's now available for yours to download at the website that's in the chat. Our colleague has typed it out, and if you may also look into the C-Circular website to download and read all different types of publications that have been released by the C-Circular project to date. We would also be able to be contacted by email, so if you may actually go to our website and contact us, we're very happy to answer any specific questions you may have. The C-Circular website is actually updated for many of the events, not only pertinent to plastics, but also marine litter policies, and also what governments are doing, and also our sister agencies and partners, and also what civil society is doing. So please check out our website. I really urge you to do that, because there's quite a lot of material there that you may find useful. And finally, this report that we're launching today is only the first step of many steps to the analysis of the perceptions of plastic waste and also plastic packaging in Southeast Asia. We know that UNEP and FIA will also conduct a similar one in 2022, which is scheduled for about 2 years' time, to see how we have changed from this time, setting a benchmark for us to understand where we are at this point. And so we'll be seeing more emerging trends and releasing more analyses for the different country-specific and also sector-specific data, and also any types of new initiatives and interventions that we have noticed for the time period. And we hope, and I'm sure to do with all of you, that we will see a positive trend in the region on plastic waste reduction and on recycling and on circular design, so that all of these things can come together to help us form a better way to control plastic waste entering nature. And so at this time, I'd like to actually end the event. Thank you so much for all our speakers and all our participants for sharing this monumental time with us. We would love for you to give us any feedback. So please be reminded that you can contact any of us, and also visit the website to download the report and the presentation you saw today. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope that you have a good afternoon and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.